I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, Pete Bowers. And Pete is the founder of the WordWorks Literacy Center, which is in Ontario, Canada. He traveled down from there to be with us today. That is also where he got his PhD at Queen's University. And during his graduate work, many of you have heard the term structured word inquiry. During his graduate work, Pete and his advisor, John Kirby, coined that term for a type of instruction that allows students and teachers to learn more about the actual English orthographic system through the process of investigating words as you learn how they work. So that is actually part of what Pete will talk to us about today. But one of the many things that Pete is able to contribute, I think, to our field is his combination of research to practice. Having done research and continuing to be involved in research, but then also being involved in serving in the classroom. He was a classroom teacher for 10 years before going back to school, and continues to stay connected to the classroom today. I will say that the very first time I heard Pete speak was in 2012 at a national IDA conference in Baltimore, and he was part of an all-day symposium that Dr. Louisa Moats had put together. And this was one of those symposiums where you're like, I get to hear Marilyn Adams speak, and I get to hear Susan Brady speak, these luminaries, and Pete was invited to speak by Dr. Moats on morphology, and he put up a matrix and changed a lot of worlds that day, a lot of people's worlds, including mine. So we're really delighted to have Pete here with us today, and I would ask you to help me welcome Pete for our keynote.
All right, well, thank you so much for that. It's a real honor to be invited to speak with you guys today. And I liked giving that historical background to this organization and related organizations. It's like you guys are doing the etymology of this learning, and there's going to be some of that coming up in my talk. So I've titled this, "The Morphological Matrix is not the destination, it's the doorway." And that's the reason for that is that people often see this thing called a matrix, and it looks like it's all about morphology. And what I'm going to try to show you today is that while that is certainly about morphology, it's also about phonology and etymology and about understanding. It's about understanding the whole system. So that's my plan. Now, if you have been to a conference in the last little while in literacy, you are seeing this word language being emphasized in a way that it hasn't been typically. And it's not just language, they're talking about oral and written language, and at the super lexical level and all the way down. There was a conference at Big Sky not long ago, and I saw all over social media that Louisa Moats had said, I should have called it language to print instead of speech to print. And I talked to her later as a bit of it's kind of an ad hoc statement because of this overarching talk about language. I think that was a signal of this. This year there was also an online talk by Charles Hume. He called language the heart of reading and dyslexia. And in that talk, he says, dyslexia has typically been thought of as a specific learning disorder arising from a selective impairment of phonological processing. Our research suggests a revision to this view and highlights the importance of a broader early language skills as a foundation for all aspects of reading. And they had really good evidence but they were talking about what they were doing was early oral language experiences with kids and seeing an important effect, which is great. But one thing I want to highlight is structured word inquiry. We emphasize that same principle, but across all of these lexical levels. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Sublexical, the word lexical is like a high register word for word. So a sublexical is anything like graphemes, phonemes, syllables, anything below a word. The lexical level is going to be word reading, vocabulary, spelling, and then supralexical is anything above the word, phrases, clauses, sentences. And I'm going to argue that we need a broader early language skills of all of that. Another thing that is kind of in the air recently are these this view that it seems like we may have some people are arguing we've overdone the phonics focus, and in relation to that other point, well, we're doing that instead of other things maybe, and we should be doing a bunch of things. Now, I'll let you just read that statement. Now, I'm not saying this is what he is saying, but when I read that, this idea that we got to dial it back a bit, I fear that people think of that we just got to bring back the pendulum as if there was some point that we were at the sweet spot. And I'm not saying that's what Seidenberg's saying, but I'm fearful that that message can be taken that way, that, well, we had the word stuff right, we just got to go back. And I'm going to suggest that we have some other things to look at. And so just to give you a frame of structured word inquiry, it's never been a response to this pendulum of the reading wars. It's not a response to whole language and balanced literacy. It's not a response to phonics. I would argue it's a response to the premise that the child learning how to read needs to learn how his or her writing system works. That is simply all it's trying to do. So wherever any other instruction does that, I'm totally good with it. Wherever instruction misguides that, that's where I'm trying to refine. And this was my experience. I myself had a crazy story with spelling. I was always a terrible speller. I'm surely dyslexic. And I'll get back to this later, that I was teaching grade 4 in 2001, when I had my exposure to a matrix that made my brain explode. And so if I'm in my 30s and suddenly I'm starting to understand spellings that nobody had ever been explained to me, then there's clearly something wrong with the instruction I'd been receiving. Now, one thing we know is, of course, written words build on spoken words. And so if we think about it this way, speech is pronunciation of meaning. And it's the second part that we're not paying enough attention to. It's got a name. The fact that all speech has these dual aspects, the pronunciation, the meaning, it's long been recognized. Hockett talked about this as a dual patterning of speech. And the thing that we need to understand if we're teaching kids how to learn to read and write is the spelling system represents both pronunciation and meaning. So how is speech and print linked? What I'm going to show you today, both now and in the next session, that of course the pronunciations of words are represented by graphemes. The meaning in spelling is via morphology and etymology. There's two ways by which spelling represents meaning: morphology and etymology. This talk is more on the morphology side, but you'll see that etymology has to be there. And the thing that I want to highlight is when we teach how those aspects of this interrelated system interrelate, take a look at those words. I picked these words from resources, from research-based resources, telling teachers to teach these as irregular because they have graphemes, phoneme correspondences that don't make sense, so they have to memorize them. It turns out when you understand the interrelationship, these are all logical, teachable, understanding spellings. In fact, this is what people with SWI, they're the most excited to teach these ones, because if you can explain the words that you couldn't previously explain, you've learned more about the system. So actually, instead of burying these as words to memorize, we highlight them as words to understand. So here's a little overview of what I hope to address today. Just an intro to SWI content and practice, how it fits in the current research. And so some topics, and I'm not very linear, so these will come and go throughout the talk, but I really am keen on talking about the role of executive processing cognitive load. So this is kind of the learning side. And then, as I said, all these layers of language, the sublexical, lexical, supralexical, how this all ties to the matrix, and models of reading and empirical research I'll be addressing. And all the way through, I'm going to be signaling this idea of instruction orthography alignment, that I think that it is a logical goal we should all strive for, to make our instruction as accurately reflective of the writing system the kids are learning. So that seems like a good effort. Now I'm going to start with the executive skills topic because I'm going to keep coming back to it. Kelly Cartwright did this wonderful talk at the recent Dyslexia Training Institute that I found really powerful. And so she's outlining 3 core executive skills: working memory, which has the storage and processing. So how do we get the lexical information stored and how easily can you process it? Cognitive flexibility is so important. This idea of being able to hold more thing in your mind than once and think of one thing and think of various ways. It's central to their theory that we'll look at, but also to what we're doing. And the other one is things. Inhibition is so important. It's funny. It's not the one that you think about first, but being able to pause and have a thought and not just jump to your first conclusion and go on. So I've highlighted those in this little box that you're going to see pop up over and over in examples of SWI instruction where I'm arguing this instruction is doing a really excellent job of navigating executive processing. So to start, though, I'm going to do something that you guys are going to enjoy. I'm going to shut up for a second because I just want you guys to look at those representations of orthography and just think for yourself, talk with your neighbors about words you notice, connections you notice, grapheme phoning correspondence. Just take a look at all of that and see what you think. Just raise your hand if you notice 2 words that are connected that you previously didn't know are connected. Can you find words that, oh, I didn't know that word was related to that word? I don't mean that you have to tell us. I'm just saying raise your hand if you haven't noticed. Okay. Because I find this stuff fascinating. One thing is, in this matrix over here, we have this STRUCT, and it builds the word structure, of course. When I came up with the phrase structured word inquiry, it never dawned on me that it also had the base for instruction. But what are you building? Well, with structure and a construction site, you're building buildings and things. What are you building with instruction? Oh, you're building knowledge. And that's an insight that I never had until I saw these words presented in this way. I particularly love this. This is called a word net. This is all from Real Spelling that we'll look at. But we can see here, if I take those parts, I get the word unconscious. So, and we see that the SCI part is about knowing. So if you're unconscious, you don't know anything. You got kids know about this. And young kids know unconscious more than they know conscious because they know you can be knocked out unconscious. But if you look at these parts, you get conscience. So close, sound so similar, but this is about knowing. Having a conscience means you know the difference between good and bad. So I want you to think about the oral language conversations that classes have when they look at these tools, and I'm going to be saying this over and over again. Dyslexics are equally invited to that conversation. They do not need to be able to read words like conscience to be able to get exposed to the written representation of that word, its graphemes, its morphemes, how it links to words they have in their oral vocabulary. They might not know the word conscience, but if they do know the word science and they do know some of these words, and you can take that meaning, that orthographic denotation that I always recommend listening to Sue talk about, to link the meanings of all of these words. So if you know one word in this net, you have access to the meaning of all of the words. And you can see these subtle differences in spelling that might get confused if you weren't thinking about the meaning units. And you get words like omniscient, right? Now, people might say, why does anybody need a kid? Well, when you get into high school, you talk about an omniscient narrator. And you have this OMN thing, like omnipresent and, omnidirectional. People hear these words, but now I can show you, it's about everything. And there's a great story that a grade 3 kid working with the Real Spelling author went through this one, and a kid said, oh, does that mean that if you're omniscient, you'd also be prescient? Because they figured that prescient is to know before. Well, if you're omniscient, I guess you know even that. But think, that's a grade 2 or 3 kid given the scaffolding to be able to work at that language. And I'm just going to tell you, you can't do this without a matrix or a word net. You can't see the interrelationships. The other thing I want you to notice, in science, which is here, that SC is a digraph. Almost nobody knows there's an SC digraph, but it's in scissors. It's in a whole bunch of words. But notice when I say conscience, it's writing sh. So it's only by comparing related words that you're going to notice these shifting pronunciations that are spelled consistently, and that's the kind of thing that we're doing. Now, you may have noticed that SCI and STRUCT aren't words. So how do I know what the meaning of those things are? Well, you kind of pick it up when you see the words that it builds, but there is a test. The way we know that is by going to etymology. They all come from, to be in this net, not only do you have to have this base, you have to have the same root, and the same over here. Etymology and morphology are totally intertwined. It turns out there's lots of interest in morphological instruction, but I'm going to show you today, I think, I will give you my evidence, we can't understand morphology if we don't understand etymology, the way they interrelate. And then you can do something. Now, my topic today with you guys is about teaching about this idea of teaching structured word inquiry. So what I did is I picked two matrices that have ideas about what I'm teaching you. One thing you could, if you were teaching about history in your class, you could do the same thing. And then you can go to have the kids write a sentence that incorporates words from these matrices to explain what we're thinking. And now we're going from the sublexical to the superlexical. And the conversation, and kids can use words that they wouldn't have, they maybe didn't even know moments ago, and integrate them into writing, in which case you have to do syntax. You have to pick the right form. Now, I didn't point to this one over there because it has this, we have this word, courage, sitting in the middle of the banner of this matrix. Now, I'll just point out, this is a grade 1 kid, not a kid who had any difficulties, but she just loved doing this stuff, and her mom loved doing this stuff, and she would come to my workshops, and so this was what they did for fun at home. Now, think about what that means. Think about how much thinking these kids are doing about words when they're not in class, when you are giving them the tools by which to get to the meaning of words via the spelling and pronunciation. Now, notice that courage in the banner of the matrix, and she's got heart under here with this little picture of a heart. How would she know that courage is about heart? Well, in Canada, we got a lot of French, so the French speakers can go, oh, I know cœur. C-O-U-R is how you spell heart in French. And if you're in Spanish, corazón, there's a signal there. But you don't even have to know that, because if you've seen the Wizard of Oz, what does the cowardly lion want? And when we say that, there's a game and oh man, that player, he plays with heart, that means he plays with courage. We already have these connections in our mind. They're implicit, though, and this makes them explicit. But I'm not going to suggest that the grade 1 kid opened up Etym Online, but I bet you she told her mom to do it. Because in her grade 1 class, the teacher did this all the time, because when they would hit words that were interesting, they were growing up in a context where they understood that not only are stories made up of words, every word is made up of a story. Every word has a history. And when you follow the history of those words, you get access to deeper meanings and connections and spelling and everything. And when you look up courage, you see it goes back to a Latin root for heart. So this means we can test meaning. It's not just hypothesis. We're going to be talking about meaning and structure. So now we get to do our first activity. So if you can grab a pen, it's a very short, this is like the shortest spelling test you've ever had. Now, some of you already got nervous because I said spelling test, but I'm not going to mark it. Now, what I think of this is as it's kind of a Rorschach test, except it's a Rorschach test for words. A Rorschach test, that blob of ink, and you say the first thing that comes to mind, no right answers, no wrong answers. Same thing here, but I'm going to show you a word, and I'm going to take it away after I show it, and I just want you to jot down the first words that come to mind. There's no wrong answer, but just what does this word, went the wrong way. What does the word disease, what words come to mind when you think about the word disease? I'm guessing people had things like illness or sickness, right? Totally logical. But now I'm going to ask you to do something a little different. This is a process that I call writing out loud. It's part of a whole kind of, what do I call them, group of practices that the overarching title is spelling out orthography, which I like because when you say spelling out, you're explaining, like, let me spell it out for you. So you are literally spelling out loud, but you're also explaining. And when you write out loud, you're doing it with a pen in your hand. So what you have to do right now, and you do it in a whispery kind of voice, but it really needs to be out loud if you're going to test my practice here. And that means if I write out loud the word disease, I have to say D as I write the D. And I have to say I as I write the I. So just write out loud the word disease at your tables. Now, did anybody notice something about the word disease that you didn't notice before I asked you to write it out? You see a word or an observation? What did you see? How many people saw the word ease in there? And raise your hand if that's the first time you noticed a link between ease and disease. Now, we have to test whether it really is there, but what I'm going to suggest to you right now is I'm going to show you they are related. Now, how are they related? So now this is where you get into the rich oral language conversations with even young kids. Well, what is the link between ease and disease? Oh, well, if you have a disease, you're not at ease. It's like a system that's out of equilibrium. If you're ill, we talk about your body being out of balance, right? It's not at ease. But we can go farther. We can say, well, our environment is seriously diseased. The climate is out of balance. We can use the word disease in more than one way. And you guys have the famous story from the 70s with Nixon about there being a cancer on the presidency. Corruption is a kind of disease. It's a system that's out of order. So look at the way that vocabulary gets expanded when you look inside words and look for those kind of conversations. But the question is, what was the incredibly complicated instructional approach I had you do to have a bunch of people in this room notice the link between ease and disease for the first time? I didn't teach you about spelling out. I have all sorts of conventions that I think are really important, but they're actually, you don't even need to know them to start. So the question is, what happened? Here's what I think. When you follow the rules and you go D-I-S, you can't help, having said DIS out loud, having the motor movement of having written DIS and seeing the DIS there does what a psychologist would say, it primes lexical information in your head. You have a DIS prefix in your head. You know distrust, disable, you know the oral prefix, you know the written prefix. So when you do that, when you go DIS, you can't help but pause. I heard people do it. They didn't go D-I-S-E-A-S-E. People went D-I-S-E-A-S-E. And then, because if you pause at the D-I-S, then you have to go E-S-E. And that pause is the way that you notice that base. People notice the prefix first, because that's what they write first. But it's interesting to me. People will say, they jump to explaining me the E's, but it was actually the D-I-S that they noticed that helped them see the E's. Right? And what I'm going to suggest is, if all of the instruction that you received since you were in kindergarten, and then all the training you received, and work that you've been doing, has not given you the affordance to notice the ease and disease, I think we can say there's something missing in the instruction that we received ourselves. Especially if all it took was me to ask you to write out loud the word disease. So, if we can notice this, the number of things we can really notice. So the other question is why? Well, I'm going to suggest this. When I was teaching grade 4, if I was going to look at the word disease in science or something, and I wrote it on the board, I probably would have done, before I ran into real spelling, I probably would say, well, we're going to look at the word disease today. I said disease. If you think di and di and z's and S-E-A-S-E, that's the only explanation I have for how you didn't notice the ease and disease before. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's another important point. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because what I'm arguing is, When you see this, you have spelling meaning correspondences that explain the grapheme phoneme correspondences and help you see them. And once you have that meaning, you can't forget. That's my argument there. But we have to be careful because maybe this is just happenstance. Maybe it's not really related to disease. Anybody remember where I go if I'm testing meaning? That's when we go to Etym Online or etymology. So I can go to here and for disease to really, for that word sum to be accurate, I need to show that the word ease and the word disease share the same root. They have to have the same etymology to have the same morphology. This is why I say you can't understand morphology with etymology, one of the reasons. So we can now confidently say this is the structure of the word disease, and you don't need anybody else to prove it for you because you've shown that the structure works and the meaning works. So now we're getting into, this is scientific inquiry that we can use in other places, and I want you to think about those executive skills. I'm inhibiting the idea of looking at the D and the Z's by forcing you to notice the morphemes. That inhibition is so valuable. The mental flexibility, but all the meanings of ease and disease, right? And by that writing process, we're binding it in this processing, we're binding the mental representations well and making them easier to access. Now we can take that word disease and not just look at one word, but we can look at its family. And so we can see in the matrix where we have disease, but I love the word, the other one I love in this is easy. You see what happened with easy? Well, it has the same base, you add the Y suffix, but there's no E. So now you have to see, sometimes when you have a base and you add a suffix, you can cause a suffixing change. And so now we have a reason to notice the suffixing change so that we can link easy to ease. And you notice a kindergartner, grade 1, grade 2, they're much more likely to know the word easy than ease. You can learn the little word from the big word. It's not always one direction. And if I had a kid saying, what does ease mean? I say, well, you're good at math, so you're going to be at ease on the test tomorrow. You don't even need to study. You'll get you know how to do it. If something's easy, you're at ease about it. And that I don't have to write a vocabulary test. It's connecting these words in a meaningful way. But we also now see that to be able to make connections, to show that easy is related to ease, you guys have to know your suffixing changes like that. And you're going to help your kids know those 3 suffixing conventions, not just for the spelling, which is how it's often taught, but for the reading, for the ability to link words. You cannot link these fascinating words if you don't know the suffixing changes. And there's 3 of them, and they're utterly reliable. Again, we're seeing how we can process all of this stuff. Now, I'm very excited that Linnea Airy has been pointing to this matrix idea recently. It's great to see the shifting and thinking about the role of meaning and morphology in orthographic mapping. But when I was starting doing this stuff, no one had seen the matrix. However, that was 2026. I was very lucky because in grade 4, I ran into this real spelling resource that is an online. Now you can access it through a subscription online, I highly recommend. But I just went to this 45-minute session in Bangkok. I was teaching in Indonesia, strangely enough, but in English. And I go to this guy's talk, and it's like, he says English spelling makes sense, there's no exceptions, it's about meaning. And I literally went to the talk to go see a snake oil salesman. I just thought it was so insane. I just wanted to see, how is he going to pretend that makes sense? And within 5 minutes, he made sense of so many spellings that my dyslexic brain had never remembered. Whoa. And so I started working with it. And then I sent this picture to my friend Michelle, who the real spelling guy. And it turned out he sent it to Marcia Henry, who I didn't know at the time. We found out later that she was at the same session in Bangkok that I was in 2001. and that she and Michelle had been corresponding. And when I first met Michelle, I said, wait a second, I remember her. She was at that session. Because I don't know if I told you this one. There was one, I remembered this distinguished woman coming and plunking the chair down, and she clearly wanted to see this talk. And I thought, okay. And at some point in the talk, Marcia just went, this is so important. And so when Michelle sent that picture to Marcia, which I didn't know he had, and then I get an email from Marcia saying, hey, could I put that picture in my book? And I always got a kick out of the fact that she always acts like I was so kind to let her have every teacher, anybody, yeah, you could take my picture, put it in her book, awesome. And so I really have benefited from Marcia Henry's work for a long time. She helped me, she wrote a letter for me to get into grad school and all this. But I just love, I told you, we're now getting into the etymology of SWI. It started a long time ago. And the other thing I want to highlight is Marcia put the matrix in 2003 in public. The next time it was in a published resource was in my paper in 2010. I don't know how people couldn't see those and jump at them. But so I'm so delighted that when I found out Marcia was here, oh. So the impact that Marcia's had is enormous, and Michelle, I will say, the only reason he went to that conference was because Marcia was going to be there, because he had very little time for most researchers, but he liked Marcia Henry. Now, so let's look at how does this fit into theory. So here's something I want to highlight. The brain's attentional, this is Marion Wolf, the brain's attentional systems are the equivalent of biological spotlights. Unless the lights are turned on, nothing else can happen. I repeat this ad nauseum because I think it's so powerful. You can't learn what you don't attend to. So what aspects of oral and written language have our biological spotlights been missing? Have a read of that statement. They're saying the letter strings are converted to phonological strings. That's where we treat speech like pronunciation. Ignoring the morpheme units. We're not drawing the biological spotlights to attend to the meaning part of the spelling system, and spelling represents both. And notice these are not, these are major figures, and this is 2011. Now in 2021, David Scher put out this data, which I think is just, wow. From the foremost cited reviews of reading, look at the occurrences of the words phonology or phonological versus morphology or morphological. The attentional spotlights of researchers has not been on this in the way that it has been on other things. So that trickles down to the rest of us. So I want to try and dive into that a little bit. If you've seen one model of reading, you've probably seen the reading triangle. And if you haven't, that's fine. I hadn't seen it until I started doing grad work. And I don't know how anybody could argue with this. Of course, to be literate, you have to link the spellings, pronunciations, and meanings of words. Like, I have no argument with that. However, one thing that confused me when I first saw it is I saw that word orthography, and I was confusing it with the writing system on the paper. Nothing in this model is in the paper. It's all in the mind. These are what are called mental representations of the written things you process, the pronunciations you process, and the meanings you process. These are in your mind. They are not out there in the world. You build them by engaging with the world, if you see what I mean. And so this is the Seidenberg-McClellan model. Later, Perfetti comes along, and he talks about the lexical quality hypothesis that my supervisor had me read. And when I'm reading it, he's talking about that what we want to do is build the lexical quality, how high quality those mental representations are, because then you get instant access when you read. You don't want to think about the subunits when you're reading. You want to get right to the meaning. Now, but Perfetti said it's not just that you need high quality representations of each of the corners. He has this idea called a constituent binding feature. And that is binding any two corners of the triangle increases the binding of the whole. So it's not just the individual parts of language. It's how they're bound together that is a separate aspect of lexical quality, and you want to get the lexical quality to the point that you have a sight word from that Ari would talk about automaticity. The other thing I want to highlight is that when I read that, and he's talking about the constituent binding, I noticed and wrote this thing to John saying, but wait a second, it doesn't mention morphology. And morphology is the only part of this triangle that links to all three corners of the triangle. So what if morphology acts as a binding agent for that lexical quality? And I have to laugh because John Kirby was an amazing supervisor. He's a bit of he doesn't let you get away with anything. And when I got that paper back, it was one of the few times he circled that and he says, remember this. So that's how we ended up developing this theory. And that was the theory that we presented first in the 2010 intervention study and then this diagram a little bit later. But now I want you to look at this part of the diagram. What is that representing? That is oral language. That's the oral language kids have when they come to school. They develop it by encountering speech, and I should have the arrows both ways because it's also built by speaking, but it's the interrelation of the speech that's out there that you build oral language. That you can't have an orthographic mental representation if you haven't been exposed to print. So this is what speech is when a kid, a healthy English speaker, enters kindergarten. They already have this morphology, phonology, and phonology. Now, remember the attentional systems are biological spotlights, so you can't have any orthography in your head yet. But what do I mean by this? I would love to do the joke sometime to a kindergartner on the first day of school and say, did you drive to school or were you driven? And they would laugh because that's insane. But nobody had to tell the kid that the driv of driven is the same meaning as the drive of drive. That they have a morphophonemic language. Speech is morphophonemic. They already have it. And the same thing if I say something or she says something. I'm not talking about the spelling yet. I'm talking about the kids use those words appropriately just in speech, because they have implicit understanding of our morphophonemic system, and our job is to make that explicit. So when we introduced print, I don't understand why we can't point to the morphology, phonology, and semantics all from the beginning, because they already have all three aspects. And then when you get exposed to print, you start to build up your mental representation. So this is now the model of a literate mind that has bound all those aspects. They can't get the orthography till you teach it. But what I'm suggesting is that you teach how it links in all of its ways. So remember Hume's argument that dyslexia has typically been thought of as a specific learning disorder arising from selective impairment of phonological processing. We're focusing so much there, and they're saying we need more. And when we are really, the teaching that we have to teach this connection. Like, I am not at all diminishing the importance of that, but what I'm saying is we can do it so much better when we teach how it works. And I bring back Cartwright's point. We see the evidence from the current research is we have kids who are decoding at level, but there's so many that are not comprehending. Well, that's because you're not teaching the meaning part. And I don't just mean at the word level. This is still word level, but also we got to teach how meaning is made by sentences and everything. That all of those parts that are central to meaning are the parts we're not teaching enough. That would be a good explanation for why the comprehension isn't matching the decoding. And so what we need to do is shine those biological spotlights on the whole system. Now, this is still the word level, right? We're still at sublexical. This is not about supralexical, but I've already signaled how we're jumping between them, and we'll do more of that. Now, I'm going to show you this video. that is of kids doing an investigation. These are kindergarten kids in Thailand, all second language learners. And I want to just give you an image of what this stuff can look like. And a central thing, and we're going to do something with this in the breakout where you guys get to do a similar activity. But what I want you to do is attend to how this teacher is engaging with these kids.
Jump. No.
And I didn't set it up. They're trying to find which words are in the HOP family, the HOP family. And there's ones that don't belong and ones that do. So the jump obviously doesn't belong. Let's see how they go.
There's no nothing wrong. Get out.
Where do you think it goes? Outside. Why do you think it goes outside?
But there's no.
One at a time. Oliver. Why do you
There's
think?
no hop.
Because it doesn't have the structure, the HOP.
Yeah. Only the E in.
And what does jump mean?
Just is like this.
So it means the same thing as hop, but it doesn't have HOP, so it cannot be in our family.
Yeah, because it's not the same one. Because this one.
That's a jump.
This wheel must be H, and this must be O, and this must be P.
So I just want to highlight right here that I think that kid is not just telling his teacher, but telling himself, I understand your game. Jump can't be in there, would have to have an HOP. Now, this kid you will see later gets distracted, is not focused. But right here, we're talking Thai kindergarten kids. He's getting letter names. He's engaging. This is still all good.
That was
Exactly, but they're not. They're different letters. Okay, you ready?
Oh. Now I'm just going to, I have to get to, sorry, I always do this. There's a nice one here. I just want to get a tiny bit.
Why, Julia?
the
Is your name Julia?
it doesn't have the word hop.
Now, the reason I want to show that, you could not activate the kid's phonology more than what that kid just did. Right? This is doing all of these things at once. Now, there's more good fun, but let's see the final part.
Here.
They just proved run didn't exist.
This one never had shop. Shop.
Can we read it? What's this make? What's that?
Shop. Shop.
Shop.
Like this. It's not
Not right now, sweetie.
but that's not and hop. It don't have hop. Don't have hop.
It doesn't have hop. Let's take a look at it.
No. Oh, this one.
Let's see. So it does have hop in it.
But it has H. It has F and H.
That is a profound observation we'll come back to.
I think it should be here. Why do you think so, Will?
I told you.
Chop and not like hop. Not hop and chop.
You're buying things. You're not hopping. You're buying things. So it doesn't have the same meaning. It doesn't have the same structure.
Notice the language she uses, so great.
Yes. What do you think so, Oliver?
Cause there's
I said, is your name Oliver?
Cause there's a H-O-P.
Exactly. But Will had a really good observation that it doesn't sound like hop because the S and H
Meant
exactly.
chop.
Now and now look, the kid's just naturally doing the blending right there, right? Now, what was, I could go on about this thing forever, but I won't. My favorite question after seeing that video is, have you ever seen a kid more focused on the SH digraph in your life? But here's the thing. Everybody has taught the SH digraph. What is it about this teaching of the SH digraph that makes us laugh when I ask that question? Because it made a difference in meaning. Graphemes and phonemes are abstract concepts. You can't hold on to them. You're not out in the world thinking about fs or sh. But when you realize, wait a sec, no, hop can't have shop in it because that is a difference. And you see how the engagement, they're running around, they can act things out. This is all meaningful exposure to words. And they learn about the words that don't belong as much as they learn about the ones that do. Now, I want to take a look at this little event in context of that binding agent thing. So that kid is saying, no, shop doesn't have an hop in it because it doesn't have an H, it has an S and H. What he is saying there, like, it doesn't work. You can't just chop off that digraph in half because he doesn't have this language, but he has this understanding already. As a Thai kid, and nascent I'm sure, but a Thai kinder kid understands something that I was never taught until 2001 with real spelling. Graphemes have to fit within morphemes. Always. There's no exceptions. So the only thing in this lesson that I would alter is I would use my tapping out. So I'm going to tap out the graphemes of the word hop, which would be H-O-P. Now you guys tap out the graphemes in shop. So if I'm teaching this class, well, let's tap out hop, H-O-P. Okay, does shop have an H-O-P in it? Let's try it. S-H? It has an S-H. When you study graphemes and morphemes together, you understand both better. And you have an intensive focus because it's understanding. And your biological spotlights can only change what you attend to, and you want to attend deeply if you're going to make changes in your mind. And the other thing that is such a clear illustration here, the second kid who's right on the ball in the first one, he has no problem with jump and hop because he can do that with single letter thinking, but he can't do hop and shop with single letter thinking. What we need to do is not think in letters, but think in graphemes. And we can see the impact with that kid right there. Notice all of the cognitive skills there, the intensive thinking, the mental flexibility, being able to deal with graphemes instead of letters. I think it's all in there. So this is this instruction orthography alignment idea. Now, I gave you this handout that is only 2 pages, but it has a little tiny URL that won't be too hard to type into a computer later that gives you a 10-page document. So you have access to all sorts of this talk, and much better than the paper because they have hot links to take you to more. So just so you know, you have access to these key concepts, including this graphic. And I just want to highlight, I made with Marie Foley for this video that I encourage you to take a look at. But notice that the alphabet letters, they're just the raw materials. They're not English letters, they're Roman alphabet letters. The I in Italian can do things that it can't do in English. It's only when we get to graphemes that we're in English. And some of those graphemes are single letter graphemes, and some are more than single letter. But this is when we're in English. And notice, you can have the Y letter, it can be a Y grapheme, but it can also be a Y suffix. Same form, different functions. And this has to do with this combinatorial idea that I won't go into too much, but the idea is that it's a universal feature of oral and written language, and it works on, it necessarily has this structure so that we can automate things as fast as possible. Small number of minimal units that bind into bigger meaningful units, that's the whole thing. And so this is how the writing system works. And let's take a look at that with this word action that could easily be, we can understand why that could be misspelled this way, yeah? This is linking pronunciation to print. This is linking print to pronunciation and meaning. But how do we figure that out? So both are plausibly, but only one spells pronunciation and meaning. And on top of that, many resources teach us a TI digraph for the sh phoneme and a TION suffix in this word. The matrix and the word sum I call combinatorial guardrails. They prevent us from making those mistakes. Because if you look at the ACT base, we can build react, acting, action, actor, actual, all these words. The banner of the matrix, that has to be a cell that goes from top to bottom, because every word represented by this matrix has to be able to fix with that ACT base. If we look at those word sums, notice how the vertical lines match perfectly with the word sums. The matrix and the word sum are in tandem. They're totally coherent. And those are the combinatorial guardrails. You can't have a TION. There's no ACK. Now you could look at the syllables ACK and shun, but then you are also binding that ACK pronunciation to the AC and the shun pronunciation, the TION, and that can hide the access to the meaning. And I don't think we're aware of that distinction nearly enough. But the other thing, we learned from that Thai kid, there can't be a TI digraph. Because you can't have one letter in one morpheme and one in another. So we can now use these tools to help us not teach just morphology, but also phonology. That's why I say the matrix isn't the destination, it's a doorway. It helps us understand grapheme phoneme correspondences. And I keep arguing falsification is our friend. We get nervous about that word, but that's science. And the great thing about falsification is it lets you learn about another way of understanding. So structured word inquiry, I could have called it scientific word inquiry because it includes falsification of things we've been taught since we're kids. It's our friend. Now, you can go to the Oxford and see, it tells me there's a TION and it gives me completion and relation, but there ain't no complete and there ain't no relay. And this is so powerful when we give kids and teachers the recognition that we shouldn't just accept what we've been taught, we should interrogate it. I use the Oxford all the time. It's an amazing resource. It makes mistakes. It was written by humans. Of course it makes mistakes. But once you have the power of looking at it that way, you can interrogate the dictionary to learn from it. And so all those pieces, you see how this is just, the matrix is building on that model. And it's also about this binding. We're binding the meaning of the word act. I can talk about, my favorite actor is some action movie star. And when you say action and act with the kids, you can point out, everybody, I have a question for you. How do you pronounce the ACT when you say acting? Act. How do you pronounce it when you say action? Action. The T is writing the sh, which most people haven't seen. Now, I'm going to skip a couple of these, but I'm talking about spelling, meaning correspondences, making sense of grapheme phoneme correspondences. I know that's weird language. But I want to highlight that a challenge that sometimes comes to me is, why are you prioritizing meaning over phonology? And that's not what I'm doing. And I think that we can think about this analogy of triangulation, both geographic and orthographic. That when you're in geography in a map, you know that if you want to pinpoint a spot on a map, you need 3 reference points. If your way of reading a map was with 2 reference points, you would think, oh, I get 2 points and I just have to walk on that line until I hit the thing I remember. That's not a very good way of using maps. And if I say to you, well, by the way, you can use 3 reference points and you know exactly where it is, it would be silly to say, why are you preferring that 3rd reference point? No, the point is you need 3. It's not that one is more important than the other, but you cannot understand in the absence. So I want to emphasize that this is not about emphasizing one over the other. It's about understanding how they all operate together. And I'll illustrate with this word. So the word does, regularly described as irregular. Well, when we just point to the spelling and the pronunciation, we wonder, what's the O doing? Or is that an OE suffix? And why is that S writings? Why isn't it spelled does like that? But what if we start interrogating our question about the word does with meaning by putting in a sentence? So I can say to a kindergarten class, she does her homework. But I wouldn't say, I does my homework. because native English kids have the syntax in their head, and maybe some better than others. And if they don't know this, I'm going to tell them, what do I say here? I do my homework. And now you can draw attention to the spelling of the D-O in both. And that's a logical spelling. It's just that the pronunciation of the base is shifting, which we just saw with act and action, and which is a feature of the entire system. But I can go farther and say, I am doing my homework. Ah, there's the D-O again. Okay. And now you see how what I did is I've worked with the sublexical, but I used the superlexical to integrate all of these pieces. And one of the things in morphological instruction that's quite interesting is the ability to choose the right suffix to make a word fit in a sentence is a morphological awareness that is more connected to reading comprehension than is being able to make sense of a new word. Not that one's more important, but why not practice that syntactic stuff? And then you can see that do and does, I can make a little matrix. It's exactly the same as go and goes. It doesn't make, we don't say goes is irregular because it's spelled like toes. But toes is T-O-E and an S. Like they're not even, you have to look at it this way. And we have to have a schema in the kid's mind. The pronunciation can change, but it keeps on going. So here we have, now we can teach the grapheme phonic correspondences. The O grapheme is writing oo, and it can do that in words like do and to. Not the most common, but it happens. And they can write the like in does or in oven. It more often writes the O like in go or cold. But notice mental flexibility. We don't even get distracted by an OE digraph that doesn't exist. And again, I'm saying we're doing all these things. Now your turn. Look at the word bin. Can you see a morphological spelling meaning correspondence that makes sense of the grapheme phonic correspondence? I have been there before. It's not an it's not a double E digraph. You can't know what the graphemes are until you know what the morphemes are. And there's nothing irregular about that. But now, wait a second, is en a suffix? Oh, well, I can show I have fallen, I will fall. I have taken, I will take. And now I got a suffixing change. So by finding a new suffix, now that's a piece that combines around the system for the same purpose. And then it made me think, oh, I'm going to have to show you that sometimes when you add a suffix, you replace an E. I don't have to do the lesson right now. I can just show you. There's nothing irregular about the bin. Now, there's a nice post by Shanahan recently about spelling instruction, and I'm biased because I'm one of the friends that he asked to talk about it, but I really thought this point is important that I want to highlight it, that students with poor phonological awareness and weak orthographic memories especially need every possible advantage. Notice all the things I'm pointing to are things that dyslexics don't have that deficit in. Now, so morphological instruction and vocabulary. I just want to point briefly to the study that introduced structured word inquiry, and I do have a copy of the book that the lessons are from. So this was the 2010 study. It was called a vocabulary study. And you see this matrix, that's the first matrix in the lesson. And what we did is we looked at word-taught words and base-taught words, and what that means is that's the level of transfer. So a word-taught word, these are word-taught words because I explicitly taught them in that lesson. But so are designate and redesign, and I probably never mentioned those. Those are words possibly encountered by that matrix. So every word that they were possibly exposed to, there's over 420 in 20 sessions, was called word-taught. Even most of them were just word-exposed. And what we found was the experimental group was better than controls at defining those word-taught words. But a base-taught word is like insignificance that isn't on that matrix, and I had to not teach it. And what we find is the base-taught words, the SWI group was better defining those words as well. That's generative vocabulary learning, and that's what people struggle to find. But it's how we learn our own vocabulary, so why not teach it? Now, we didn't get effects at the affix-taught words, which was words that I hadn't taught the base. So they didn't get an advantage on that. But we also did a task where you circle the base, and they were better at that too. So you're even getting advantage on the words you didn't yet define better, but you're better able to find the base. Over time, I think this will help in all of those. Now, there's also we did recently, the thing about that study is we didn't have a comparison group without the matrix and the word sum. So we can't claim it was the matrix, although that certainly seems logical. So we did a study with adults where we compared presentations, and I don't know of any study that has compared types of morphological instruction. Right? We know we should teach it, so we got to compare to find out how to do it better. I'm saying, please use the matrix. Now, what we did is we presented the same words to university students, either in a list, no morphological condition, or an affix-centric matrix or a base-centric matrix. And what we found was that the list was the worst for memory. All we did is ask them, after you looked at it, we didn't teach it. They looked at it, write as many words as you can remember. And we found not only were both morphological conditions better than the non-morphological, the base-centric was better for memory than the affix-centric. And when you look out in the world at morphological resources for teachers, they're way too often organized around affixes. The base holds the meaning, and you can learn so much more that way. I'm very excited. There's a group, Structured Word Inquiry Research Vanguard, that's been doing, just kind of started not too long ago, and they're about to publish this paper. They replicated our study, but with grade 4 and 5 kids. And they did the same idea, same order of effects, base-centric, more effective than affix and than list. And the most striking difference was the list condition was terrible. They did two trials of it. At the first trial, they got almost very, very low with the list. And the second trial, it didn't get better. For both the affix and the base-centric, the second trial were major improvements, and to the point that base-centric was significantly better for learning than that. So we actually have this new actual research on just the presentation. Imagine if we also teach it. Now, I'm just going to point out a couple of things. I'm not sure how much of which I should focus on, but here is the supralexical level. The reading rope is a model that includes the supralexical, sublexical, and all that. And the idea is that language comprehension and word recognition start out as separate, and then they come into skilled reading. But I'd like to highlight there's no mention of morphology, and the language comprehension and word ID is considered separate at the start. Oh, I keep pushing the wrong way. Now, the active reading model that Duke and Cartwright came out with specifically built on that 2021 model, and they made the argument, wait a second, word recognition and language comprehension, they were never separate. They always overlapped. And that they put morphology into their model in a way that was missing. And when you look at this model, I want to highlight the active self-regulation thing here. Comprehension strategies, vocabulary strategies. We see that so much in the way we do SWI. And when you look at the bridging processes where the word recognition and language overlap, print concepts, reading fluency, vocabulary knowledge, all of those actually implicate morphology, but then specifically morphological awareness, and my favorite, graphophonological semantic cognitive flexibility. I know it's a mouthful, but it's actually really good, but they're nice by saying letter sound meaning flexibility. But you can see how much we're doing that. What I will point out, though, this is all over the place. Every model I know of, every reading model I know of since the reading rope mentions the absence of morphology in previous models and the absence of the interrelation to morphology and phonology. Aries' theory came out in '98, and she had morphology from very early then. And she was before, but we've just been missing this. I'm arguing that our binding agent model fits right in their bridging process. That we can, and the thing is, there's lots of models saying do this, but I don't see many models of how to help teachers teach it. And I'm arguing we've had the tools for a long time. Now, let me just make a quick choice here. People ask me, but we don't have enough evidence with this that we can teach it from the beginning. Well, it's true, we don't have enough research evidence, but what do we do when we don't have direct evidence? We look for indirect evidence. I can point to a couple of things. We had 2 meta-analyses of morphological instruction where phonological outcomes had the greatest effect size from morphological instruction. The phonological gains were bigger than the morphological gains by teaching morphology. Have a read of what they wrote to explain that. That synergistic, that interrelationship, we should be teaching from an early age. That's 2013. Recently, there's a 2020, is it 2020? Yeah, study. This is about teaching, this is about spelling instruction for dyslexics, and the effect. And what they found is, we did not find that phonics instruction is more effective than morphological interventions for the early years. It seems likely that phonics, morphological, and orthographic interventions across, that's an important thing to see. This is the one that I think really shocks people. Against our hypothesis, the efficacy of phonics interventions decreased with increasing severity of spelling deficits, whereas the efficacy of orthographic and morphological interventions increased with that increasing severity. So this is, I'm arguing this makes sense because those of us with poor phonological awareness, poor orthographic memories, we need the aid from the part we don't have a deficit in to help us with the part we have a deficit in. So it's not about reducing attention to grapheme phonic correspondence, it's about increasing it by making our instruction match the stuff. Now I understand it's totally true, it's a small data set, not conclusive, but it's in the opposite direction of how we've been thinking. So if we agree with this statement that we need to learn how the writing system works, what are the consequences of not teaching it? I'll do one thing and two things, and I'm going to show you a video to end on. Avoiding teaching about spelling meaning correspondences at any age, it turns out it forces us to teach according to an unstated and untested hypothesis. I would argue it this way. The way we typically teach builds on a hypothesis that we haven't stated, that graphemes in words that cannot be explained by phonology alone, like does and all these words, should be taught as irregular grapheme phonic correspondences. Children need to learn one at a time, because if you don't teach about the role of meaning, they're irregular. But they're not irregular because the system is irregular, they're irregular because we're not teaching the system as it is. My hypothesis is that teachers should see if students of any age can bind these words into memory as sight words more effectively if they explain the grapheme phonic correspondences with reference to meaning cues. Now, the other argument I make, so these words we can turn not into memory things, but learning things. The other argument that I make is when people challenge us about the early years, okay, if you're uncomfortable with doing it the early years, when do you teach this? It's never taught. So I would have more sympathy for the argument that we don't have evidence for doing it young if you were simultaneously saying, yeah, but we should do it later. But I'm suggesting that we can do this from the start. And so what I'm going to do, in the breakout session, we're going to look a little bit at the sentence matrix idea that is a way of taking that matrix idea to the sentence level. And you have links to this stuff. I have a video that you can watch me teach my very first lesson with the grade 3s. That the best part is where I make a mistake in my first lesson and the kids find it. That was my favorite bit. So we'll look at that. But what I want to show is an illustration of basically all of these parts coming together with this video of a kid in grade 7. Now this is a kid that only entered, this is Ann Whiting's class. She was in Malaysia. This is many years ago. She was a humanities teacher, and she is just one of the most amazing people. And it wasn't an SWI class, a real spelling class. She just taught humanities, but she leveraged linguistic study for it. And so I'll end on this, and Sue has some things to add. But the point I want to highlight is this is a kid new to this, and the job is to explain the concept of a dissident that he picked to talk about. And I want you to listen to what he does.
The word dissident is divided into 3 morphemes, which are dis, side, no e, plus ent. The suffix in this word is ent, and the prefix is dis. However, the base element in this word is side, no e, which originates from the Latin root sedere, to sit. An intriguing fact about the Latin root sedere, to sit, is that sit or to settle, it forms two base elements, which are SIDE, no E, and SED. Both base elements are bound base elements, meaning they do not make perfect sense on their own, and they need prefix or suffix to make sense. Yeah. The meaning of the word dissident is to literally sit against authority, and related words are words that share the same base element, which would be president and resident, like settle, and preside and reside. Yeah, and the word dissident links to the current situation in Libya, as the Libyan president Muammar Gaddafi overruled Libya. He cheated in an election. Even when the votes were against him, he still claimed to be Libya's president, and he stripped Libya's citizens from many rights, such as democracy. And now the Libyan citizens are dissidents. They're dissidents who are rebelling against Gaddafi and are fighting against injustice. Yeah, and I believe that bystanders are the reason and are responsible for the terrible things in the world and the increase of perilous things, and the power and control of a certain person, and that if you just sit and do not act, then it does have an effect. However, it has a negative impact. However, when you stand up and act or speak, then it does have a positive impact, and it does make a difference. So the word dissident, and this also links to the quote by Albert Einstein: the world is a dangerous place, not because of the people who do evil, but because of the people who sit and let it happen. So right now in Libya, there are dissidents who are sacrificing themselves and putting everything on the lines for the good of many.
Yeah. Now, the reason I want to end on that is leveraging sublexical, lexical, supralexical study, oral language, written language, and I would argue that not only could he not articulate those ideas that effectively if he hadn't worked that way, he wouldn't have even had those same ideas. He's not reading a script. And when he almost forgets his punchline, all he has to do is say sedere to sit again, and oh, yeah, Einstein line. So I just want you to see that this is not spelling instruction. This is what this can lead to. And I'll end there. I'm a little bit over. And just so you know, I do have copies of my book and some other stuff that people might want to take a look at. And I'll leave that.